Well, good morning, everybody. It's Tom Christie back in the painting studio. This will be session 7 of the Drake Canvasback gunning decoy, and we should be able to finish it up in this session. We're going to put a quick gunning paint job on this bird. I have a video, a full-blown video on my website, tomchristieart.com, for purchase if you're looking for more of a decorative hand vermiculated painting style with a lot more detail. Today's video is just going to be on a basic blocked in gunner style paint job. In the interest of time and so that I'm not duplicating myself, I went ahead and combed this bird. I have a separate video strictly on how to comb like this, and you can check that out. I didn't want to duplicate that effort here, but very quickly I start with a mixture of Liquitex, gesso, and probably 90% burnt umber heavy body acrylic. And I laid that on pretty thick on this bird because of the cork, and that really helps seal up the cork well. And I sponge that on first. Then I come back with a brush, more material after I map out the vermiculated areas, paint that material on, and then use a comb like this to go through the paint and leave these ridges for the vermiculation. Again, check out that other video if you want to see that from start to finish. In today's video, I'm just going to focus on blocking in a gunning paint job on this Canvasback. Before we start painting, too, just a note, I use a piece of 350 or 320 grit sandpaper, very fine, and just drag that across the combing after it's thoroughly dried. That just knocks down any little snags or peaks of paint that we don't want, and just make sure everything is smooth before we start putting on the base coats of paint. Okay, I've mixed up some off-white, and I use Liquitex white gesso and a touch of Josanya raw umber for this off-white color. I did get a question that do you have to use gesso? And you really don't. You can use titanium white in this mixture. I just use gesso because it's got a lot of pigment in it and it comes in bulk form, and I use a lot of gesso, so it makes it handy to use for my whites. But I'm going to lay this on pretty heavy. This will take a couple of coats, and you can see I'm painting right on top of the vermiculation. And I'm going to work on that for a while and then come back. Okay, I've got the first coat of white. You can see this tertial area. I've made room for some wingtips and speculum. And this is a good time I like to blow dry this first coat and look at the tone. Is it too brown? Is it too light? And just get a feel for, then I'll adjust my mix if needed on the second and final coat. And that's what I'll do next. For the second coat, I did add a little more of the white gesso to brighten it up a bit, because when we pull through this vermiculation with the gray to highlight the vermiculation, is going to dull things down a bit, and I don't want it to be too brown. So I'm going to lighten it up just a touch, and then we'll be good to go. Okay, I've got the second coat of off-white on there, slightly brighter, and I'm happy with that color. Now I want to go with straight carbon black, Josanya, on the breast and on this tail section back here. Working with the carbon black, and I've got a little bit of a chisel angle shaped brush because it helps me get a sharper line along edge like this. That's just me. This, in the gunning categories, a lot of times they don't want any splits. They want a simple paint job to keep their decoys in good shape and keep with the tradition of a basic gunning decoy. So I'm not going to put any splits along here. We're just going with block painting. For the speculum, I'm using a little Josania Nimbus Gray, darkened a little bit with a touch of carbon black. While that paint is wet, I'm just using a little white gesso and a little angle brush, chisel shape and lightening the back edge of this a bit, just to set it off a little bit. And they tend to have some white near the end of the speculum like this. I'll do that on both sides. Now, just to finish off the speculum, I've got a little detail brush, and we're just going to pull in these very characteristic carbon black markings on the speculum. Just a single brush stroke, kind of wider at the back and narrowing at the front. Maybe 3 of those. That's good. Now I'm doing a 50-50 roughly mix of Nimbus Gray and Burnt Umber Josania. I'm going to block in the primary feathers. Kind of a gray-brown tone. Once I get those blocked in, we'll come back with just some very basic outlining. Now I'm just using Nimbus Gray, Josania Nimbus Gray, and I'm going to go in and put an outline of these primary flight feathers. Not a lot, just enough to define them. I'll do the same on the other wingtip and we'll be done with that. For the tail, I'm going to use that same Nimbus Gray Burnt Umber mix and just paint it that color top and bottom. Now you can leave that tail plain if you want. I'm just going to take the Nimbus Gray again and just put a few feather markings on the tail just to give it the appearance of some tail feathers. That one I've kind of dropped down because I want to break up that thick tail a little bit, but not going overboard here, just a few marks. Before we move on to the head, I want to do the dry brush vermiculation. I've got a nice flat wide brush, about 1 inch wide. I'm using the Nimbus Gray, Josania Nimbus Gray. You load the brush and then wipe it off a little bit so there's not too much paint in the brush, and then just carefully drag it over the surface, and it just picks up the vermiculation ridges that we combed in to the bird and gives you a pretty realistic version of vermiculation very quickly. See if I can get a better shot of this as we go. So I'm just pulling in one direction right now. Again, not very much paint on the brush. That's key. If you load up too much paint in the brush, it's going to start going down in the valleys, and you want to just hit the highlight ridges. This vermiculation is pretty subtle on a Canvasback, so we don't want it to be too dark. I'm going to do the rest of the bird. As your brush unloads, you can press a little harder and maybe go in both directions to pick up some highlights in the other direction. The tertials tend to have a little darker marking, still subtle, but I'm going back and forth over that area a little more than the others, and maybe the top of the side pocket here to darken that vermiculation a bit. Hopefully you can see that. Just a quick look at that vermiculation. That took about 2 minutes to dry brush over that combing. And again, we want the Canvasback body to remain pretty light as it projects from a distance, but that combing does a great job of quickly representing that vermiculation that you see on a Canvasback drake. I'm going to darken this vermiculation in this area near the rump. I've just got some carbon black, very little paint on my brush, just scrubbing that back and forth, and you can just gradually darken it as much as you like. But it just puts a little contrast between that area of the rump and the side pocket. Okay, I'm using a mix of gold oxide, brown earth, and Norwegian orange with a touch of burgundy to come up with this kind of brick color characteristic of the Canvasback. I'm just going to paint that over the entire head to begin with. While everything is wet, I'm going to use some pure gold oxide. Just kind of put a little bit of a highlight, blend a little bit of a highlight into the cheek area. And put a little bit on the side of the crown here. And just blend that in to the surrounding area. Don't want to overdo it, but just trying to give that cheek a little bit of a highlight. I'm going to do the same thing on these neck muscles, or whatever you want to call them, kind of the feather grouping, to give that a little bit of a highlight. This is real quick and just kind of wet on wet blending. And I want to blend that out so that it's not stark, but it just gives a little subtle highlight to those areas of the neck. Okay. Going to hit that one more time. lighten it up a bit more. Again, just in this cheek area under the eye. This is going to be darkened, so I just want to hit the highlight here. But again, this is quick, wet on wet blending. In a more decorative bird, I would use probably an airbrush to do more work on this. But for this gunning bird, that's pretty good. Now I'm just going to use carbon black and paint the bill. Okay, I've got the decoy mask off, and I've got burnt umber, Josania burnt umber in the airbrush. I want to begin to darken the crown back to about this point, and then come across in front of the eye down to the bill and darken this area in front. Now I've added some carbon black to that mix, and I'm going to focus on the area closest to the bill and darken this a little bit further. Quick shot of the head with the masking removed, and now I'll take the paint off the eyes. And a final touch, this characteristic chin mark under a Drake Canvasback's bill. If I can stay in the viewfinder here. The ducks will never see it, but we know it's there. All right, I'm gonna let that paint dry, and then I always seal my decoys with a couple of coats of dull coat, Tester's dull coat. Then if it's too flat, I'll give it a little matte Krylon finish to put a little sheen back on the decoy. And then for the bill, I use Deft semi-gloss wood finish. And then I go back and forth between matte finish and that to get the right amount of sheen on the bill. This was a quick paint job, about 3.5 hours from beginning to end, including filming. So it doesn't take long to get a nice gunning paint job done. I hope this project has been helpful. We've started from a block of cork and a block of Tupelo and a bottom board, and we've got a working decoy, and hopefully that's been helpful, and you can use these techniques to make your own decoys. Until next time, Tom Christie signing out. Thanks so much for following along.